All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep into transcendental arguments. You know, the kind of arguments that try to uncover the hidden kind of necessary things that need to be in place for us to even have thought and experience and knowledge. Really getting to those foundational elements that we often take for granted.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're going to be looking at the work of Immanuel Kant, drawing from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And our mission today is to kind of dissect these transcendental arguments.
Okay, so let's get into it then. Let's start with Kant's Transcendental Deduction. This is from his critique of pure reason. Now, the sheer ambition of this project is kind of breathtaking. Kant was taking on the empiricist view that all knowledge comes from sensory experience. He's saying, no, they're these fundamental concepts, the categories that are actually prerequisites for us to even have experience in the first place.
That's right. So Kant is arguing that your mind isn't just passively receiving information, it's actively structuring it using these inbuilt frameworks.
Right.
And he used the term deduction in a kind of legal sense. That is, he was trying to justify the claim that these a priori concepts coming from the understanding have a legitimate right to apply to the objects that we encounter in our experience. And these concepts, they're not empirical concepts that we get from seeing, touching, and so on. Rather, they're the very architecture of our understanding.
Okay, and so Kant gave us this very meticulous list of these categories. These are ways that we categorize things. So under quantity, we have unity, plurality, totality. Under quality, we have reality, negation, limitation. Then relation, inherence, and subsistence, causality, independence, community. And then modality, possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, necessity, contingency. You know, what's kind of mind-blowing about this is just the sheer systematicity that Kant is putting forward here, this complete inventory of the fundamental ways that our understanding operates.
Yeah, absolutely. Kant's project was in direct confrontation with David Hume's skepticism. So Hume famously questioned our justification for metaphysical concepts like personal identity and causality. And he argued that for a concept to be valid, it had to resemble a sensory impression. So since we don't have a sensory impression of something like causal power itself, Hume concluded that such concepts lack objective grounding. Now, Kant agreed with Hume to the extent that you can't have an empirical deduction of these concepts. That is, you can't derive them from experience.
Right. Hume basically, he challenged philosophers to produce the sensory evidence for something like causation. And when no one could do it, he basically concluded that our belief in causation was more like a psychological habit rather than a genuine insight. So Kant was agreeing that, no, you can't just point to an experience and say, look, there's unity, that path was closed off.
But Kant, in a move that redefined metaphysics, completely shifted the terrain of the argument. He said, okay, what we need is what I'm going to call a transcendental deduction. And this starts not with concepts themselves, but with what he thought was undeniable about the nature of human experience. And he argued that the applicability of these a priori concepts is actually a necessary condition for that experience to be possible in the first place. So in other words, it's kind of like a deduction in reverse. You're showing what must already be in place for our experience to have the structure that it does.
Okay, so it's not about deriving concepts from the world, but it's about realizing that the way we observe the world already presupposes that we have these tools, these conceptual tools.
Right.
And Kant's mechanism for how this is possible, is synthesis. So this is the mind actively bringing together different representations into a unified whole. And he argued that this synthesis wasn't optional. It's a prerequisite for coherent experience, and the categories are essential for guiding this process.
And on one way of reading Kant, what's sometimes called a metaphysical idealist reading, the objects of our experience are constituted, at least in part, by this mental processing that's guided by these categories.
Okay.
And in other words, the categories aren't merely being applied to some pre-existing world, but they're partly constitutive of how that world appears to us in the first place, as an ordered and intelligible reality.
Okay, so to make things clear, I think it's important to distinguish between the transcendental deduction and the metaphysical deduction. Now, the metaphysical deduction is Kant's attempt to derive the list of categories from the logical forms of judgment. And that's basically the way that we structure our thoughts. So think of it as trying to identify the fundamental building blocks of our understanding. And then the transcendental deduction takes this list and it argues why these building blocks must be used in constructing our experience.
Exactly. So the metaphysical deduction gives us the inventory. It tells us what the categories are. but the transcendental deduction tells us why they are the categories that we use to structure our experience.
Okay, so uh, all of this was a response to Hume's associationism. So this is the view that our minds are just collections of sensory impressions that are linked together by association, and so there's no need to posit any inherent a priori structures or a unified subject.
That's right. So Hume's view was very parsimonious in the sense that he said all of our mental contents are just perceptions. These are either vivid impressions or fainter ideas. And he said these are ordered solely by principles of association, so things like resemblance, contiguity, and so on. And he didn't think that there was a self as a distinct active synthesizer of experience, but rather that the self is just a bundle of these fleeting perceptions.
But Kant says, wait a minute, this purely associative model can't explain some very basic things about our experience. And he introduces this concept of synthesis, which he defines as the act of putting different representations together and grasping what is manifold in them in one cognition. So this is the mind actively unifying the various elements of our sensory input.
And Kant wants to stress that, unlike Hume, this synthesis is not a passive linking of perceptions. It requires the application of concepts, specifically the categories, to order and structure this manifold of representations. And furthermore, Kant insisted on the necessity of a subject, an I, which is distinct from the representations themselves. And this I is what performs the synthesis. So this is a key difference from Hume's bundle theory of the self.
Right, so we've got this active process of synthesis going on, guided by a priori categories, performed by a subject that's distinct from its experiences.
Exactly.
Now, the B deduction, which is in the second edition of the Critique, is kind of the more refined version of Kant's transcendental argument. And it uses what's often described as a two-pronged strategy. You have the argument from above, which starts with self-consciousness, and then you have the argument from below, which starts with the experience of objects. Let's start with the argument from above.
The argument from above takes its starting point, self-consciousness, which Kant also calls apperception. And this is basically just the capacity that we have to self-ascribe mental states. So to think, this is my thought, or this is my perception, and Kant argued that apperception has what he called a necessary unity.
Okay, necessary unity. What is it about this unity that is necessary?
So what's necessary is that all of my diverse representations must be capable of being attributed to a single identical subject. So that is a self that persists throughout all of these self-attributions and which is distinct from the representations themselves, but which is also capable of being conscious of those representations. So this is what Kant calls the principle of the necessary unity of apperception, and this is the basis of the argument from above.
Okay, so it's not just some random collection of thoughts and experiences. They're all unified by the fact that they're all potentially mine. They're all attributable to me. And this I, this subject, Kant argues, is not just another representation that we observe through inner sense, right?
That's right. So Kant argues that if the subject were a representation, then we could in principle have an intuition of it. That is, we could experience it through inner sense. Moreover, he argued that if the I were simply a representation, then it wouldn't be able to give us the multiplicity and variety that we find in our experience, because the manifold of our experience originates in sensory intuition, and that's something different from the pure non-empirical I.
Okay, so this act of self-attribution, this I think that Kant famously talks about, this is pure in the sense that it's not derived from any prior experience or observation. And it's original in the sense that it's fundamental. It's not grounded in any more basic representation of the self.
That's right. And this is where Kant's famous dictum comes in. He says, it must be possible for the I think to accompany all my representations. Now, importantly, this doesn't mean that we're always consciously thinking I think. Rather, what it means is that any mental content that is genuinely ours must, in principle, be connectable to this unified self-consciousness. Because an unattributable representation, so a representation that couldn't be accompanied by, I think, would basically just be cognitively inert. It wouldn't really belong to our experience.
Now, there's some debate among scholars about how strong this claim is supposed to be. Some interpretations say that it's enough that we can consciously attribute a representation to ourselves. Others say that we have to be simultaneously conscious of all the representations that are unified by the I think.
Yeah, so that's a key point of contention. Some interpreters, like Howell, for example, argue that for Kant, it's not enough that we can become conscious of each element individually. Rather, we have to be simultaneously aware of all the various elements within a single experience.
Hmm.
And this co-consciousness would then necessitate the act of synthesis. But other readings suggest that the focus is less on simultaneous awareness and more on the very representation of the identity of the subject across these diverse experiences.
Right, and this representation of the identity of the subject, this is where Kant sees Hume really falling short. Because for Hume, it's just a bundle of perceptions.
Yeah.
And so how can you have this unified stream of consciousness? How can we say that these experiences are all mine when there's no self that persists through them?
Yeah, Kant argues that on Hume's view, empirical consciousness is dispersed and without relation to the identity of the subject.
Mhm.
So Hume might be able to tell us about a sequence of perceptions, some of which are internally self-referential in some sense and which are causally linked. But Kant says that's not enough because what's missing is a single conscious subject that owns these perceptions
Right.
and that can synthesize these perceptions into a unity. So there's no I that persists throughout the stream of consciousness.
So on Hume's view, it's just a collection. It's
Mm.
not there's no real subject there.
That's right.
Now, Hume might respond to this by saying, well, maybe perceptions are intrinsically self-conscious, or maybe the causal coherence of the bundle is what grounds the idea of the self. But Kant says that even a causally integrated bundle still lacks that real ownership. It's still just a collection.
Exactly. So Kant would say even if you had this perfectly coherent bundle of perceptions, it wouldn't have that single conscious locus of ownership. There would be no owner.
Okay, so now we get to the next stage in Kant's argument from above.
Hmm.
So how do we represent the identity of the subject?
Right.
It's not something that we directly perceive through inner sense.
That's right. So both Kant and Hume agree that we don't have an inner intuition of a persisting self. So the question is, how do we account for a representation of this enduring I? Well, one possibility is that we have an indirect representation and that this representation is based on something about our representations themselves. And this is the option that Kant takes.
Okay, and so what's this unifying feature?
The unifying feature, Kant says, is the result of conjoining our representations and being conscious of the act of synthesis.
Okay.
But importantly, Kant says that we're not directly conscious of the act of synthesis itself. Rather, we're conscious of the unity that results from the synthesis.
Okay.
So this unity, it's not just that representations happen to co-occur. Rather, this unity involves things like inferential and causal integration. So our experiences are kind of woven together logically and causally. And one way to see what Kant means here is to contrast this with the case of something like multiple personality disorder, where this unity of consciousness seems to break down. And there are other views about what this unity might consist in. Some people think that it has something to do with the temporal ordering of our experiences. But for Kant, the key is that this unity necessitates a synthesizing power of the understanding.
And this synthesizing power is the faculty that actively combines these representations. And it does this a priori, using the categories.
Mm.
Okay, so the argument from above is basically showing that the very possibility of self-conscious experience presupposes this activity of the understanding.
Right.
And it presupposes the use of a priori concepts. Okay, now let's turn to the argument from below. This is the one that starts with our representation of objects.
So the argument from below appears in sections 17 to 20 of the B deduction, and it shifts focus to our experience of a world that's populated by objects. And there's debate about how the argument from above and the argument from below fit together. Some interpretations, like what's called the single substantive premise interpretation, which is defended by Strawson, say that the whole B deduction, including the argument from below, ultimately rests on that premise about self-consciousness.
Okay, so the idea is that if we can even talk about our experiences, this is my experience, then we're already implicitly committed to the idea of an objective world.
That's right. So the idea is that you can't have consciousness of your experiences as your own without also experiencing a world of objects.
Okay.
And not all commentators think that this is what the deduction is trying to do. That is, not all commentators think that Kant is primarily trying to refute external world skepticism.
Okay.
But nevertheless, Section 17 provides us with a really important characterization of what it is for us to represent an object. And this characterization provides us with an alternative to Hume's associationism.
Okay, so in this context, what does it mean to represent an object?
So Kant says that an object is that in the concept of which a manifold of a given intuition is united. Now, importantly, what Kant means by an object here is an objective feature of reality. It's something whose existence and characteristics don't depend on our fleeting perceptions. So for Kant, an object is not just a random collection of sensory data, but it's something that is actively structured by our understanding through the use of concepts.
Okay, so it's not just like sense data, but it's actually something that we're actively structuring.
Exactly. And some interpreters, like Allison, have proposed what they call the reciprocity thesis.
Okay.
And this is the view that the unity of apperception is both necessary and sufficient for representing objects.
Okay.
So Allison argues that the very unity of our consciousness constitutes the relation of our representations to an object, and this is what establishes their objective validity. However, there are some problems with this strong reading. Um, First of all, textually, Kant goes on to make further assumptions about object representation in the later sections. And second of all, logically, there seems to be a gap between the necessity of consciousness for this unification and the sufficiency of consciousness for representing objects.
Okay, so if the reciprocity thesis is maybe a little bit too strong, what's the role of Section 17 in the argument?
So it's more likely that Section 17 is trying to give us an alternative to Hume's account of how we represent objects. It's laying out the claim that representing objects requires the active unification of a sensory manifold using concepts. And this claim isn't taken to be already proven, but it's something that Kant then goes on to try to substantiate in sections 18 to 20.
Okay, and so in those sections, he wants to show why association isn't enough to explain our representation of objects.
Exactly.
And the concepts of universality and necessity play a central role here.
That's right. So in section 18, Kant says that what distinguishes our representations of objects is that they have objective validity. And what that means is that they're representing features of reality that hold independently of our individual perceptions. And he argues that such objectively valid representations have to possess a certain universality and necessity. And he contrasts this with the unity that's achieved through association, which he says is contingent and merely subjectively valid.
Okay, so the idea is that if I associate the feeling of warmth with sunshine, that's a subjective connection that's based on my experience, and it's not a universal or necessary truth. It's not that sunshine has to be warm, but when I represent that a physical object occupies space, that's different.
That's right. So that's the kind of universality and necessity that Kant's looking for. And he argues that the transcendental unity of apperception, which is brought about by this a priori synthesis, is what gives us the universality and necessity that we need for objective validity. And he gives some examples of this. So he talks about perceiving a house from different angles, and we see it as a whole that's composed of different parts. And although our perceptions of the house are subjectively successive, we represent the parts of the house as objectively simultaneous. And then he talks about seeing a boat moving downstream. And in this case, both the subjective perception and the objective event are successive. And Kant's point is that the way that we represent these phenomena objectively is characterized by this universality and necessity. And he says that association can't account for this, because association, being contingent, can't explain why these representations have to be universal and necessary.
Because association is all about accidental co-occurrence in my experience. It's not about any connection that's out there independently of me. And so for instance, you could think about word association, how we associate the word dog with bark or leash, but these aren't necessary connections.
Exactly. So Kant says association can't ground this universality and necessity that we find in our objective representations. And then he gives this argument. He says, look, our representations of objects possess objective validity, and that involves universality and necessity. And since association can't explain those, we have to have another faculty beyond association. And this faculty is the faculty of synthesis, which operates using a priori concepts.
Now, Geyer has raised an objection here, hasn't he? He says, can't just assume that we have knowledge of necessity.
That's right. But I think we can defend Kant here by saying that he's not presupposing a fully worked out theory of a priori necessity here. Because even Hume acknowledged a form of necessity that arises from constant conjunction. So even Hume thought that, in a certain sense, there's a psychological compulsion to expect a certain event to follow another, given that they've been constantly conjoined in our experience.
Right.
And maybe what Kant's trying to do here is just say, look, association can explain the way that we represent these phenomena as having these universal and necessary features. So, for instance, take the example of the house again. We represent the parts of the house as simultaneously existing, and association just can't explain that representation.
Okay. So the idea is that there must be some faculty other than association that's responsible for this representation.
Mm.
And it can't just be more sensory data. It has to be something else.
Mhm.
And that something else must be this faculty that employs a priori concepts.
That's right. So what Kant's trying to show is that we need a mental faculty beyond association, and this faculty can't consist just of sensory items.
Okay.
And so it must employ a priori concepts, that is, the categories. Now, an associationist might push back here and say, well, hold on, maybe repeated sensory experience could give us the appearance of universality and necessity. And that's something that Kant needs to engage with. However, he wants to emphasize this really fundamental difference between these contingent associations that we form in our experience and these more robust, necessary connections that we find in our objective representations.
All right. So Kant's arguing for this a priori synthesis as the basis of our objective experience.
Right.
Now, how does he specifically connect this back to the 12 categories?
Okay, so in sections 19 and 20, Kant argues that judgment is the act through which we synthesize these representations.
Okay.
And he says that every act of judgment employs these specific forms of judgment. And these forms of judgment, which he's already derived in metaphysical deduction, are directly correlated with the categories. And so by establishing this link between judgment and the categories, Kant is trying to show that the categories aren't just these abstract concepts, but they're actually being used in this really fundamental act of making sense of our sensory input.
Okay, so we're not just stating facts when we judge, but it's really about the understanding bringing order to all these sensations. And these logical forms of judgment, these are like the form of a statement, like every S is P, or if A, then B.
Right.
And these reflect the categories that are at work.
That's right. So Kant defines judgment as the manner in which given cognitions are brought to the objective unity of apperception. And he argues that judgment is objectively valid. That is, it aims at universal and necessary truth. And he says that if we didn't have the power of judgment, then our representations would remain merely subjective. We wouldn't be able to distinguish between what's objectively true of the world and our own internal states. And then this is where the link with the 12 logical forms of judgment comes in. So in the metaphysical deduction, Kant has derived these 12 logical forms and he maps them onto the 12 categories. However, this is one of the aspects of the deduction that has received a lot of criticism because some people have argued that Kant doesn't really provide us with a very good reason to think that these forms of judgment are mapped onto the categories in this one-to-one way.
Okay.
So for instance, Geyer has argued that Kant doesn't really give us a good argument for this, and he just kind of asserts that the categories are the forms of judgment applied to intuition.
Okay.
But there have been attempts to clarify this connection. And Longness is one commentator who's done this, and she argues that the understanding is actually the faculty of judgment. And she says that the logical forms of judgment are actually just forms of combining concepts. So for instance, we have categorical judgments where we're saying that something falls under a certain category. And then we have hypothetical judgments where we're saying that if one thing is true, then another thing is true. And Longness argues that what makes judgments capable of being true or false is that they relate our representations to an objective world. So the logical forms are what give judgments this objective validity. And she says that logical forms play two roles. So first of all, they play a role in analysis, which is subsuming intuited objects under concepts.
Okay.
And then secondly, they play a role in synthesis, which is unifying this manifold of intuition. And she says that the understanding functions in both of these ways. And so in its synthetic role, the understanding adds what Longness calls transcendental content to the forms of judgment. And this content relates to the forms of intuition, space, and time.
Okay.
And so what you get are these, what Kant calls categories or schematized concepts, which can apply to our experience. So to give you an example, you can take the categorical form of judgment and add spatial and temporal content, and what you get is the concept of substance. And then you can take the hypothetical form of judgment, add spatial and temporal content, and you get the concept of cause.
Okay, so it's like the framework of our thinking is being infused with this raw material of our sensory experience, space and time, to produce the concepts like substance and cause that we use to understand the world.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this brings us to the end of what's traditionally considered to be the first step of the B deduction, which is the end of section 20.
Yeah.
But Kant says that the argument isn't actually complete yet. And so this leads to this idea of a second step.
That's right. So in section 21, Kant says that the transcendental deduction still requires a great deal of exposition. And this has led to a lot of debate about what the so-called second step consists in. And a lot of the debate has focused on sections 24 and 26. So for instance, Attucks and Pettin thought that the deduction was divided into two steps. An objective deduction, which goes up to section 21, and then a subjective deduction, which comes after section 21. And they thought that the objective deduction was about the objects of our understanding, whereas the subjective deduction was more about the cognitive faculties themselves.
Okay.
But Henrik disagreed with this division. He pointed out that Kant says in the A preface that the demonstration of the objective validity of the categories is actually completed in section 26. And section 26, according to the A preface, is part of the objective deduction. So one way to reconcile these views is to say that the second step is really about clarifying how the categories relate to the objects of intuition and experience.
Okay.
And this would then show that we're actually using the categories correctly.
Okay, now Gomes, drawing on Van Cleve's analysis, has raised a worry here.
Yeah.
So he says, even if the first part of the deduction shows that we're employing the categories in our judgments, how do we know that they actually apply to the world? How do we know that we're not systematically mistaken?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So Gomes is saying that even if our judgments do use the categories, maybe we're just misapplying them to the world. Maybe the world doesn't actually conform to these categories.
Okay.
And so he suggests that the second step is trying to address this problem. And he thinks that Kant does this by looking at the structure of our representations of space and time. And Kant argues that space and time are pure forms of intuition, and they themselves exhibit a structure that lines up with the categories. And this is what ensures a correspondence between our understanding and the phenomenal world.
But even if our representation of space structure is space itself, couldn't there still be some kind of mismatch? I mean, for instance, we might perceive space as Euclidean, but maybe its underlying structure is actually non-Euclidean?
Right, so that's Van Cleve's objection, and he's saying that even if we accept Kant's transcendental idealism, even if we say that space is structured by our representations, there could still be this fundamental mismatch between the way that space appears to us and the way that it actually is in itself.
Okay.
And a really important text for understanding how Kant's thinking about the second step is the note to B160-1. And in this note, Kant says that our geometrical representation of space is more than just the bare form of intuition. He says that it involves a kind of unity of the manifold that's given in our intuition, and this unity comes before concepts.
Okay.
But it presupposes a non-sensory synthesis by which the understanding determines sensibility. So Kant seems to be saying that there's a kind of foundational unity in space and time that isn't given by the categories, but which is a prerequisite for the categories to apply to space and time.
Okay, so now the question is Kant positing a pre-categorical unity of space and time here?
Yeah, so that's a really important interpretive issue. Some commentators have argued that Kant is committed to some kind of unity that's independent of the categories. So these are the non-conceptualists. Other commentators, the conceptualists, have denied this. So for instance, some people have argued that this pre-categorical unity comes from productive imagination.
Okay.
Longinus, for instance, thinks that there's a pre-categorical synthesis by the understanding itself. And other people have argued that there are actually multiple kinds of unity, some of which require the categories and some of which don't. So for instance, Onoff and Schulting have talked about the unicity of space, and they think that this unity doesn't require the categories.
Okay.
And Roosevelt has distinguished between two different kinds of synthesis. He calls them decomposing and composing synthesis.
Okay.
And he argues that our intuition of space involves a decomposing synthesis. So this is where we start with space as a whole, as an infinite whole, and we mentally divide it up into parts. But he says that for the categories to apply to space and time, there has to be a composing synthesis, which is where we actively construct unities out of these parts. And so the transition from this infinite whole to determinate parts is where the categories come in.
Okay, so maybe the argument is that although we might experience space as a unified infinity, we also understand it as being as having determinate parts.
Right.
And for this understanding, this requires the categories.
Exactly. And so Roosevelt argues that the composing synthesis is what accounts for the unity of these finite spaces that we distinguish from each other in the decomposing synthesis. And it also accounts for what he calls the world unity, which is the unity of all possible finite subdivisions within this infinite space. And so since these composing syntheses involve the categories, this shows that the categories actually structure space and time. And given Kant's idealism, since space and time are structured by our representations, then the categories also apply to the objects within space and time.
Okay, that was a really comprehensive overview of the transcendental deduction. Now let's turn to the refutation of idealism. So, what was the kind of idealism that Kant was targeting here? And what was his strategy for arguing against it?
So the refutation of idealism was added to the second edition of the Critique, and it directly targets Cartesian skepticism about the external world. So Kant calls this problematic idealism, and this is the view that the existence of objects outside of us in space is doubtful. And maybe we can't even prove that there is an external world.
Okay, so after all this intricate work of showing how our minds structure experience, he still felt the need to go on and say, look, there's an actual external world out there.
That's right. Kant's strategy in the refutation of idealism is really ingenious. He tries to show that we can derive the existence of external objects from our awareness of the temporal order of our representations. So he starts with the fact that we're aware of the order in which our experiences occur, and he thinks that we get this awareness from memory.
Right, so I know that I had coffee this morning before I started this discussion. It's
Exactly.
not the other way around.
And so Kant asks this really crucial question. He says, well, what is it that enables us to have